Look, I didn't do anything wrong, just followed my heart when it felt finally alive again. We were supposed to have a romantic vacation to fix things, but the moment I met someone who actually listened, I walked away. The next morning, I found out my husband hadn't just gone home. He'd gone to a lawyer. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I really thought the trip would fix us. Adrian had been so quiet lately, and I convinced myself that a week by the ocean would bring us back to the way things were. I picked the resort myself, an expensive one with white sand and rooms that smelled of citrus and luxury. When I booked it, he only nodded. No excitement, no smile. I remember thinking that even his gratitude sounded like duty. "We could use a break," he said. Just that. We arrived on a Thursday, and by the time we checked in, the air between us already felt stale. I chatted with the receptionist, laughed too loudly, flirted even, just to remind him that people still noticed me. He didn't react. He carried the bags, thanked the staff, and disappeared into the room like a shadow following the script of a polite stranger. That first evening, we sat at the beachside restaurant under strings of golden lights. I tried to make conversation about work, our son, anything. He answered in short sentences, calm and neutral, like he was in a meeting he couldn't leave. I told him he didn't even look at me anymore. He said, "I do. You just don't like what you see." I almost laughed at the boldness of it. Instead, I told him I missed who we used to be. He said nothing. Later, at the hotel bar, I noticed the photographer, the kind of man who carried himself like the world revolved around his smile. Julian Hart. He was charming in a loud, easy way that made people look up when he entered. He offered to take our picture by the beach. Adrian said he wasn't in the mood, so I went alone. Julian said I had eyes that looked like they wanted to escape. I told him he wasn't wrong. The next morning, Adrian was already at the gym when I woke. There was a note on the counter. "Breakfast starts at 8. I'll see you there." Nothing affectionate, just instructions. I met him at the table later, smiling like I wasn't furious. He asked if I'd slept well. I said yes. I didn't ask him the same. When Julian passed by our table taking photos of another couple, he winked at me. Adrian didn't seem to notice, or maybe he pretended not to. I told myself that if he wanted me to act like a wife, he should have treated me like one. That afternoon, I went for a walk along the beach. Julian caught up to me, camera in hand. We talked about nothing. Sunsets, travel, how couples lose each other in routine. He said, "You look like someone waiting for permission to start over." I told him maybe I was. When I went back to the room, Adrian was on the balcony reading. I said, "I met the photographer again." He nodded without looking up. "Good for you." It was the way he said it, flat, almost amused, that made me decide I wasn't going to keep begging for his attention. That night after dinner, I changed into a dress that was too bright for the occasion. I told him I was going to the bar for a drink. He said, "Don't get lost." I said, "Maybe that's what I need." At the bar, Julian was there again, talking to guests and laughing. When he saw me, he smiled like he'd been waiting. I told him I needed something strong. He ordered 2 glasses of rum and told me I looked out of place in my own story. I laughed too loudly again. He asked if I was here alone. I said, "Not yet." For the first time in months, I felt noticed. Alive. Adrian's silence had become a mirror I didn't want to look into. Julian was the opposite. Words, attention, eyes that lingered. He made me feel like the version of myself I used to love. I told myself it was harmless, a little rebellion, a reminder that I still existed. When I checked my phone later, there was a message from Adrian. "Room keys on the table. Don't wake me when you come back." It sounded like a dare. I read it twice, then turned my phone face down. Julian asked if I wanted to see the photos he'd taken that day. I followed him to the hotel patio, the air thick with salt and music. The ocean was black behind us. He showed me a picture of myself, looking away from the camera, hair tangled in the wind. "That's the real you," he said. I didn't argue. He asked what I was running from. I told him I wasn't running. I was remembering how it felt to be wanted. When I finally left the bar, it was late. The corridors were quiet, the sound of waves filling the silence. I stood outside our room for a long time, keycard in hand. I could hear the faint sound of the TV inside. My chest tightened. I turned around and walked the other way. By the time I reached Julian's room, I wasn't thinking about consequences. I was thinking about how good it felt not to be invisible. Hours later, I sent Adrian a text. "I need some space to think. Don't wait up." He didn't reply. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, too bright for how heavy my head felt. Julian was still asleep. I slipped out quietly, half expecting to find Adrian waiting in the hall, ready for a fight, for something. But he wasn't there. When I got back to the room, it was spotless. His clothes were gone. His watch, his phone charger, even his toothbrush, gone. On the nightstand was the room key and a folded note. Just 3 words written in his clean handwriting: "Enjoy your space." For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Then, without thinking, I laughed. A sharp, nervous sound that didn't feel like amusement. I told myself he was being dramatic, trying to teach me a lesson. But when I called the front desk, they said he'd already checked out that morning. No forwarding number, no message left. Standing there in the middle of the room, barefoot and dizzy, I suddenly realized the silence he'd always used so well wasn't passive anymore. It was final. And for the first time, the quiet felt like punishment. The morning after he left, I convinced myself he'd cool off and come back. I even ordered breakfast for 2, setting his cup out as if that would summon him. But by noon, reality started to press in. His suitcase was gone. The front desk said he'd paid for his half of the trip and checked out alone. No message, no contact, just gone. Julian found me sitting by the pool, sunglasses hiding my puffy eyes. He asked if I was okay. I told him Adrian had stormed out after an argument. That made it sound like I was the one left behind, not the one who walked away. He shrugged and said, "Some men don't know when they've already lost." It sounded comforting at the time, so I let myself believe it. I spent that afternoon pretending I was fine, swimming, drinking something tropical, letting Julian's camera linger on me while he said things like, "You look free for once." But when I checked my phone later, there was still nothing from Adrian. Not a single word. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. By evening, the guilt started whispering, but I drowned it out with another drink. Julian said, "He's probably embarrassed. He'll call." I nodded, because that was easier than facing the truth. The next morning, I decided to go home early. When I checked out, the receptionist looked uneasy. She handed me a sealed envelope that had been left at the desk, my name written in Adrian's handwriting. Inside was one line: "Please make sure Owen is with your parents when you get home." That was it. No love, no signature. Just instruction. The flight back felt endless. I rehearsed a dozen speeches, how I'd tell him it was his fault, that he'd pushed me away. By the time the plane landed, I'd convinced myself I was the victim. When I arrived home, his car wasn't in the driveway. Inside, everything looked untouched but lighter. Some of his things were gone: his laptop, a few suits, the framed photos from his desk. I walked from room to room, half angry, half terrified. I called him again, still voicemail. I sent a text: "Can we talk like adults?" Then another: "I think we both overreacted." Still nothing. That night, I went to my parents' house to pick up Owen. My mother met me at the door, already frowning. "What happened on that trip?" she asked before I even spoke. "Clara called me." I froze. She told you, I asked. My mother sighed. She didn't need to tell me much. She said Adrian's staying with her, and that you might need space. I laughed sharply. Of course she said that. She's always wanted him to look like the saint. My mother gave me that look, half pity, half disappointment. Maybe he doesn't need help looking like one. I took Owen home, trying to keep my voice steady. He asked why Daddy wasn't there. I told him Daddy was visiting Grandma for work. He said he never takes his work there. I told him to brush his teeth. The next morning, I checked the bank app to make sure we could cover bills. The joint account was gone. I stared at the screen, refreshing it like it was a mistake. The mortgage was under his name too. My pulse spiked. I called the bank, demanding an explanation. The woman on the line said, "Funds have been transferred to a secured account. You'll need to contact the other account holder for details." I hung up before she could finish. I sent Adrian a new message. "This is petty. You can't just take everything." No reply. At lunch, I called my sister, Lara. She sounded hesitant. "I'm not taking sides," she said immediately. I asked, "So you already talked to him?" She said, "He sent me an email. He said he wanted to make sure you and Owen were okay financially. He's setting something up for your expenses until things are sorted." I was stunned. "He's acting like we're divorced," I said. She was quiet. Maybe he's preparing to be. That night, I sat on the couch scrolling through photos from the trip. The ones Julian had taken. Me laughing in sunlight, hair wild, drink in hand. They didn't look romantic now. They looked like evidence. When Owen went to bed, I poured a glass of wine and called Julian. He sounded distant, like I'd interrupted something. "Everything okay?" he asked. I told him Adrian had left, that he'd frozen our accounts. "You didn't tell me you were married," he said flatly. "You didn't ask," I snapped. He sighed. "I don't do drama, Narina." The call ended there. I spent the next day calling lawyers, friends of friends who gave vague advice I didn't understand. Every word sounded expensive. One of them said, "If he's already moved assets, you might be too late." In the afternoon, my mother showed up uninvited. She looked around the half-empty living room. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I said, "Wait for him to realize he's being ridiculous." She shook her head. "He's not being ridiculous, Narina. He's protecting himself." Later that night, as I sat scrolling through my inbox, a new email arrived. The sender, Adrian Vale, legal representation. My heart pounded as I opened it. The subject line read, "Notice of intent to separate, asset protection, and custody discussion pending." The message itself was brief, written by his lawyer. Words like petition, documentation, breach of trust jumped out like bullets. At the bottom was a digital signature. I stared at it for a long time. Then I laughed, sharp, hollow, nothing like humor. He wasn't going to fight. He was going to erase me. I poured another drink and texted Lara. "He's lawyering up. Can you believe this?" She replied after a few minutes. "You shouldn't have left him that way, Narina. That way." I read those words again and again. It wasn't just a vacation anymore. It was the beginning of something irreversible. And for the first time since he walked out, I felt afraid. Not that I'd lost him, but that he'd stopped caring whether I existed at all. For the next few days, I refused to believe any of it was real. I told everyone that Adrian was just being dramatic, that we were taking a break. It sounded better than saying he'd gone to a lawyer before even giving me a chance to explain. I kept repeating that line so many times that I almost believed it myself. I posted photos from the vacation, me on the beach, laughing in that bright yellow dress. The caption read, "Sometimes peace means walking away." Within an hour, the likes poured in, along with supportive comments. I needed that, the validation, the reminder that people still saw me as the strong one. That night, Lara called. Her voice was tight. "You need to take that post down," she said. I asked why. She said, "Because everyone knows what happened. People talk, Narina. His co-workers saw those photos." You look proud of what you did. I rolled my eyes. People always twist things. I'm not ashamed. She said quietly, maybe you should be. After the call, I deleted the post but saved the comments. I couldn't stand the silence that followed. I started calling friends, retelling the story with small adjustments each time. How Adrian abandoned me on vacation. How he overreacted when I wanted space. Most nodded along, saying he'd always seemed cold, but a few asked things like, why didn't you just talk to him? Or didn't you meet someone there? I changed the subject quickly each time. The next morning, an email arrived from his lawyer. It contained a preliminary list of shared assets and documents requesting my acknowledgement of marital breach. The words looked unreal on the screen. I called the office number in the signature, but the assistant told me politely that all communication should remain formal. I hung up shaking. Later that day, my mother stopped by unannounced. She sat on the couch, her hands folded in that patient, heavy way she always did when she was about to scold me. He's not fighting with you, she said. He's just gone. I said, he can't just vanish. We have a child. She said, he hasn't vanished, Narina. He's preparing. I asked, for what? She hesitated. For a life without you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I poured a drink and messaged Julian. He answered after an hour with a simple, hey, you okay? I typed, not really. Everything's falling apart. He replied, you'll land on your feet. You always do. It was a kind thing to say, but it didn't sound like care. It sounded like distance. The next day, I took Owen to school and ran into Clara outside the gates. She looked composed, the way she always did, her hair pinned neatly, her tone controlled. He's staying with me for now, she said. I told her she didn't have to involve herself. She said, he doesn't need my involvement. He needs peace. You made that impossible. I snapped. You always thought I wasn't good enough. She said softly, no, I thought you were too restless to love anyone properly. I drove away shaking, but her words clung to me. That afternoon, I met Lara for coffee. She kept checking her phone while I talked. I told her I thought Adrian was trying to punish me financially. He's making me out to be some kind of monster, I said. She asked, did you tell him about Julian? I said, it wasn't serious. She said, it was serious enough for him to leave. I slammed my cup down. You're supposed to be on my side. She said, I was, until I realized you don't even know what your side is. When I got home, there was another envelope waiting in the mailbox. Inside was a formal petition signed by both lawyers. The title read, Separation due to irreconcilable differences and breach of trust. My name was printed beneath his in clean, even font. I sat at the kitchen table staring at it. Every sound in the house felt loud, the fridge hum, the clock ticking. I wanted to call him, to beg, to scream, to remind him that we'd built a life together. But then I remembered the way he'd looked at me the last morning of the trip, not angry, not even hurt, just done. That night, I tried calling him again anyway. To my surprise, he answered. His voice was calm, almost polite. What do you need, Narina? He asked. I said, you don't have to do this. We can talk. He said, we already talked. You just didn't listen. I said, you're being cruel. He said, no, I'm being careful. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone until the screen went dark. The next day, people started whispering. At Owen's school, one mother asked quietly if everything was okay at home. At work, my manager avoided eye contact. Sienna, my co-worker, finally said, I saw your husband's name on a legal notice. It's circulating. My face went cold. She added gently, you should probably stop sharing things online. When I got home that evening, Lara was waiting at my door. She looked pale. You should know what's coming, she said, handing me her phone. It was a screenshot. Adrian had submitted timestamps, photos, and messages as part of the evidence. including one of me leaving the bar with Julian. I could barely breathe. "He's serious," Lara said. "He's not just angry, he's building a case." I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. "He wouldn't use that against me," I whispered. She didn't answer. After she left, I sat there for hours, staring at the wall, trying to understand how silence could become such a weapon. For years, I'd mocked him for being emotionless, for never fighting back. Now, his quiet was the sharpest thing I'd ever felt. When I finally looked at my phone, I saw one unread message, an automated email from his lawyer, acknowledgement of receipt confirmed. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a pause in our story. It was documentation of its end. The first court meeting was nothing like what I expected. No shouting, no drama, just quiet paperwork and words that sounded like they belonged to strangers. I wore a beige suit and tried to look composed, but my hands shook as I signed my name over and over. Adrian sat across the table, expression unreadable. He didn't even glance my way. When the mediator asked if we'd spoken privately, he said, "There's nothing left to discuss." His calmness made my throat tighten. I tried to smile, to make him look at me, but he didn't. His lawyer began outlining our finances, every account, every asset. I didn't realize how much he'd already moved until the woman said, "All transactions appear to have been initiated before the separation notice." I wanted to shout that he'd planned this, but my own lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Don't react, it makes you look unstable." So I sat still while my world got divided by line items. When they discussed Owen, I finally spoke. "He's my son too," I said, trying to sound calm. Adrian nodded once. "Of course," he said softly. "That's why I want what's best for him." His tone was neutral, but the implication was clear, that I wasn't what was best. After the session, I followed him out of the building. "You're really doing this?" I asked. He didn't stop walking. "You said you needed space," he said. "I'm giving it to you." I said, "You know that's not what I meant." He turned then, eyes steady. "It's exactly what you meant." Then he left, like the conversation was already closed. That night, I called Lara. "He's acting like a machine," I said. She sighed. "He's acting like a man who's finished." I said, "You're not helping." She said, "You're not listening." Days turned into a blur of emails and phone calls. Each message from his lawyer was colder than the last. Transfer confirmation attached. Custody arrangement draft enclosed. Pending mediation update. I started waking up at 3 a.m, scrolling through old photos just to see his face. One afternoon, Clara called. Her voice was controlled but firm. "I won't get in the middle," she said, "but I will make sure Owen isn't caught in this." I told her she'd always taken his side. She said, "There's only one side when a marriage breaks because of lies." Then she hung up. The following week, I saw Julian again by accident. He was at a cafe downtown, camera on the table, talking to a new group of tourists. When he noticed me, he looked uncomfortable. "Hey," he said. I told him about the legal mess, how Adrian was turning everything against me. He frowned. "You told me you weren't married." I said, "We were practically over." He said, "Apparently not enough." I wanted him to defend me, to say I didn't deserve this, but instead he said, "You should probably focus on fixing yourself." Then he left. That night, I stared at my reflection in the dark window. I didn't look like the woman from those vacation photos. My face was pale, drawn. My eyes had that hollow look you get when you've lost too many arguments you thought you'd won. A few days later, another envelope arrived. Inside were copies of messages, mine, the ones I'd sent to Julian while Adrian slept in the next room. The timestamps matched the dates on our trip. I flipped through them, each page heavier than the last. At the bottom of the pile was a short note from Adrian's lawyer. All communications verified and filed. I called him immediately, even though I knew he wouldn't answer. To my surprise, he did. How could you do this? I demanded. He said, you documented everything yourself. I said, you're destroying our family. He said, no, you did that when you left. I told him he was cruel. He said, cruel would have been staying and pretending I could trust you. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He didn't sound angry, just tired. That was worse. Anger meant there was still something left to fix. A few nights later, Lara came over with takeout. She barely ate. He's finalizing, she said. His lawyer filed for full custody this morning. I dropped my fork. He can't do that, I said. She said, he already did. They're using the messages as proof of instability. I said, instability? I'm not crazy. She said gently, you've been drinking every night, posting online, calling people non-stop. That's what it looks like to them. I slammed my glass on the table. He's making me out to be the villain. Lara looked at me sadly. You gave him the script. After she left, I opened my laptop again. The hearing dates were already set. I scrolled through the documents, each one stamped and signed. My own name beside his, repeated again and again. It felt like watching myself fade line by line. That night, I dreamed about the beach. In the dream, I was calling for Adrian, but my voice didn't carry. The waves were too loud. He stood at a distance, back turned, hands in his pockets, watching the horizon. When I woke, the sound of the ocean was still in my ears, but it was only the hum of the refrigerator. I checked my phone again, hoping for something, anything from him. There was one new email. It wasn't from him, but from his lawyer. Mediation complete. Next step, final hearing. I read it twice, then closed the screen. For the first time, I didn't cry. I just sat there in silence, realizing what it meant. He wasn't fighting me anymore. He was finishing me. And the worst part, he was doing it exactly the way I once said I wished he would. Quietly, efficiently, without emotion. The weeks leading up to the final hearing felt unreal, like living inside someone else's story. The apartment I'd rented after leaving the house felt temporary, full of things I didn't love, and silence that never stopped humming. Every day started with coffee I didn't finish, and ended with messages I typed but never sent. I kept waiting for Adrian to change his mind, to call and say we could work something out. But the calls never came. I tried to keep some control by telling people my version of events. To co-workers, I said he'd become distant and cold, that I'd simply fallen out of love. To my parents, I said he was punishing me over one mistake. My mother looked at me for a long time before saying, "You stopped calling it a choice." I pretended not to understand. My father stayed quiet, just shook his head when I mentioned the hearing. Lara stopped picking up my calls. When she finally answered one night, her voice was flat. "He's moving on, Narina," she said. I snapped. "Already?" She said, "Not with someone, just with his life." Then she hung up. I started scrolling through social media more, trying to find traces of him. His account was gone, deleted, even our old photos disappeared. The emptiness of it stung more than if he'd blocked me. It was like I'd never existed. Julian messaged me once, out of nowhere. "You doing okay?" I typed back, "Not really." He didn't respond. A week later, I saw his profile tagged in photos with another woman at the same resort where we'd met. The caption said, "New season, new light." It made me want to throw my phone across the room. The day before the custody meeting, I went to see Owen at my mother's house. He was building something with blocks on the floor. When I sat beside him, he said, "Daddy says I can stay with him longer next week." My throat went dry. "You like that?" I asked. He nodded. "He makes pancakes every morning. He doesn't get mad if I spill." I smiled tightly and said, "That's good." When I left, my mother followed me to the door. "Don't make him choose," she said quietly. "He's just a child." I said, "He's my child." She nodded. "And Adrian's." That night, I couldn't stop pacing. Every sound felt too loud. I opened old emails, reread our first conversations, his notes about grocery lists, school schedules, the things that once built our life. I tried to find where it all broke, but it was like watching a bridge crumble in slow motion. One wrong word, one small push, and everything had collapsed. At 2 a.m., I finally wrote to Adrian, "You're really taking Owen from me?" After everything? I hit send before I could think. The reply came in the morning. "This isn't about taking him. It's about giving him peace." I wanted to scream. Peace was the word he used every time he wanted to end an argument. Now it was his justification for erasing me. When I arrived at the lawyer's office the next day, the air was sharp and cold. Adrian was already there, sitting straight, hands folded, no expression. His lawyer started talking about stability and parental conduct. Then came the exhibits, screenshots, emails, even one from Julian that said, "I didn't know you were married." I felt the heat rise in my face. I said, "You're using my private life as evidence." Adrian didn't even look up. "You made it public," he said. The mediator asked if I wanted to respond. My voice cracked when I said, "I was lonely. I made mistakes." The room was silent except for the rustle of paper. Adrian's lawyer said, "Our position remains unchanged." When it ended, I walked out before anyone else. Outside, the sky looked grey, the kind that feels like it's pressing down on you. I waited by the curb until Adrian came out. "You can't just rewrite everything," I said. He adjusted his jacket, calm as ever. "I'm not rewriting it, I'm documenting it." For a moment, I wanted to slap him, to make him feel something, but instead I whispered, "You'll regret this." He said, "I already regretted staying too long." He walked away before I could reply. That night, I went home and poured myself another drink, but it didn't taste like anything. I opened the custody notice again, tracing the printed words. Temporary primary custody awarded to Adrian Vale pending final hearing. It looked so official, so final, yet the emptiness behind the text felt like punishment. Later, I video called Owen just to see his face. He was in pajamas, smiling sleepily. "Hi, Mummy," he said. I asked if he missed me. He said, "Daddy says we'll see you soon." I smiled until the call ended, then cried silently into my hands. After I hung up, I checked my email. There was one unread message from my lawyer with the subject line, "Hearing confirmation. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that every decision, every word, every lie had led to this point. Tomorrow, everything would be decided, and the scariest part wasn't losing, it was realizing that Adrian had already won, not through anger or revenge, but through something colder. He'd done what I never thought he could, stop needing me completely. The final hearing felt like the end of a long illness. There was no shock left, just exhaustion. The courtroom was plain and quiet, filled with people who didn't care about the story, only the paperwork. I sat beside my lawyer, my palms sweating, my chest tight. Across the table, Adrian looked calm, his face unreadable as always. He wasn't performing, wasn't angry. That made it worse. The judge began by summarizing the case, dates, petitions, evidence submissions. Hearing my own name attached to words like infidelity, neglect, and instability made my stomach twist. When my lawyer spoke, her tone was softer, almost pleading. She said I'd been under emotional strain, that the affair was an impulsive mistake born from loneliness. The judge nodded but didn't look moved. Adrian's lawyer responded simply, "The documentation speaks for itself." Adrian never once looked at me while they read the messages aloud, my text to Julian, the ones I'd thought I deleted. Hearing them out loud was unbearable. Each line sounded smaller, pettier, crueler than I remembered. I tried not to cry, but one tear slipped anyway. When it was Adrian's turn to speak, he stood slowly. He didn't read from notes. His voice was calm but steady. "I loved my wife," he said. "I did everything I could to make things work. But when someone tells you they'd rather be with someone else, you eventually believe them. The courtroom was silent. "I'm not here for revenge," he continued. "I just want peace for my son. He deserves a home without noise, without blame." He sat down. That was it. No dramatics, no anger, just the truth, simple and devastating. My lawyer whispered that I should say something. I stood, legs shaking. "He's painting me as a villain," I said. "I made one mistake, and now he's using it to take everything. I'm still Owen's mother." My voice broke halfway through. The judge waited until I was done, then nodded, expression neutral. When the ruling came, it was quick. Full custody granted to Adrian Vale. Spousal support and asset division as per documented agreement. I barely heard the rest. My ears rang. Adrian thanked the judge politely, shook his lawyer's hand, and walked out without looking back. I just sat there, staring at the empty space he'd left behind. The bailiff finally told me I could go. I nodded, but I didn't move for a long time. Outside, the sun was too bright. I found a bench and sat down, clutching the folder of documents. People walked by without noticing me. For a moment, I wanted to call someone, Lara, my mother. But what would I even say? I lost everything because I wanted to feel wanted. There was no version of that sentence that didn't sound pathetic. I walked home slowly, the air heavy and still. The apartment felt colder than usual when I stepped inside. I put the papers on the counter, next to the empty wine glasses from last night. For a while, I just stood there staring at the mess I'd made, both literal and otherwise. When my phone buzzed, I jumped. It was a message from Clara. Just 4 words, "He's at peace now." I stared at it, then deleted it. An hour later, I opened the drawer where I kept the old photos. The one on top was from that same beach trip, Adrian standing beside me, one arm around my waist, both of us squinting into the sun. I'd thought I looked radiant in that picture. Now, all I could see was the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. I sat on the floor, tracing his outline with my thumb, trying to remember when he'd stopped loving me. Maybe it hadn't been a moment at all. Maybe it had been slow and quiet, like sand slipping away from underfoot. As the evening light shifted, the apartment grew dim. I realized I hadn't eaten all day. My stomach growled, but I couldn't move. I kept hearing his words from court. "I just want peace." They echoed until they lost meaning and became something else entirely. A sentence, a boundary, a door closing. Later, when it got dark, I checked my email. There was one new message from his lawyer. Final settlement completed. No further correspondence required. I read it 3 times. The words were precise, polite, absolute. No further correspondence required. That was the phrase that finally broke me. I picked up my phone to text him. Something simple like, "Can we talk?" But I stopped before typing. What was left to say? He'd already answered me. In every silence, every calm signature, every line of paperwork. I closed my eyes and let the quiet fill the room. For the first time, I understood what his peace really meant. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't hatred. It was absence. And in that absence, I realized I'd gotten exactly what I said I wanted: space. Only now, I finally understood what it cost. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.